listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson. Unfortunately, my co-host, Matthew Fisher, was not able to join me this week, but fortunately, we have a fantastic guest here to join us this week by the name of Denis McCormack. Now, if you've not heard of Denis before, you should have. He was one of the co-founders of Australians Against Further Immigration, also a co-founder of the Australia First Party alongside Graham Campbell. Both of these organisations have tremendous importance, especially in Australia's fight back against multiculturalism, mass immigration, and various other factors which have become super relevant today as we've seen Australian society transformed by these two large forces in particular. So welcome to the podcast this episode, Denis. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, John.
Before we go too far into the topic of immigration in general, would you like to, first of all, give us a recount of your time in politics, your story from beginning to now, and what you've been up to along that way?
Well, I spent a couple of years in the People's Republic of China, both learning and teaching. Got back here in early 1986, and I was made aware just by reading the papers when I got back to work, various directions that the country and the bureaucracy and the mainstream media were taking towards a complete change in our society brought about through mass immigration and multicultural policy. And after agonising for a while, I wrote a few letters to the paper, and one day I got a knock on the door from a complete stranger who said, I saw your letter in the paper, and I thought you might like to know that there are some folk who are trying to get an organisation off the ground, and they're going to have their first meeting soon, and you might be interested in going. So I did. I was a guest speaker there at the first meeting, and it was decided to form an association by the name of Australians Against Immigration. So that percolated away for a little while. We gathered our thoughts and our source materials and so forth, and had another meeting, and the members were a bit concerned about the name of the organisation, that it was too stark and definitive. So it was voted at the meeting that the organisation change its name to Australians Against Further Immigration. And that was a softening of the original name that went down well. And we started to build a membership base, and by 1989, we'd had a few meetings. We started in 88, and by late 89, we were sort of chuffing along as a small organisation. We thought, well, we might just have enough members now to start a political party. So we applied to the Federal Electoral Commission, and we didn't hear anything for a while, and we ended up waiting literally till the day before Bob Hawke called the 1990 election. We got notified that we'd been passed to be registered as a federal political party. So we went from a lobby group that not very many people knew about to federal political party status and into a federal election campaign overnight. It's interesting to this day. If there was that much panic about us being around, it certainly wasn't evident at that stage, because all they had to do was wait a couple of days and say, oh, sorry, the election's been called, and I'm afraid we can't register any more parties because of that. But we got in and had to decide who was going to be a Senate candidate, and I ended up being the number one candidate. We attracted a political scientist from Canberra by the name of Professor Arthur Burns, who'd been part of the establishment, especially the international affairs sort of part of ANU. And Arthur rang me up and said, look, I saw that piece you had in the Canberra Times, and I'd love to be a candidate for the party. I'm happy to move to Melbourne for the duration of the campaign. My mother lives in Kooyong, and I'd be happy to stand in Kooyong as a House of Reps member for you. So he then said, I'm old enough to have taught Geoffrey Blaney when he was at Melbourne University back in the 40s after the war. And he said, if you'd like to check my credentials with Professor Blaney, I suppose you could get in touch with him. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I've already been in touch with him, but I'll be in touch with him again to check you out, so to speak. So thanks for the invitation to do so. And he said, no problem. Let me know how you go and we'll be in touch. Anyway, Arthur moved to the electorate where his mother had a place. She was in care at that stage, so he had the place to himself. And, of course, the 90 election campaign rolled and we couldn't get a look in anywhere. Although Arthur Burns, he was Australia's answer to Henry Kissinger, and he wrote books on the balance of power and nuclear deterrence and blah, blah, blah. But only late in life, after he'd actually retired from ANU, he was emeritus by the time I came across him. And he filled us in on a whole lot of stuff about the way the world works and the way politics work. He was a professional psephologist, election expert, and he was part of the team that were charged with the responsibility of putting together the new way of electing people to the Senate, which it turned out he wasn't very happy about the work they'd done, and he wasn't particularly proud of it, but he said, I'll make up for hopefully any of my shortcomings. Well, he was the brother of Creighton Burns, who was a very famous, in Melbourne, a very famous person because he was the well-respected editor of The Age. So poor old Arthur still couldn't get any coverage. And then a couple of weeks into the election campaign, after the candidates had been settled, we had that young chap from the, what was the name of the band? I think, was it the Whitlams? When, what was his name? That young chap who...
Before my time, I think, that one.
Well, there was a chap who was on telly with a series called Don't Forget Your Toothbrush, and they were an irreverent young band. And this chap decided to stand for Kooyong. So he ended up being the celebrated wizard candidate, independent in Kooyong, and got a lot of coverage. Very few votes, but a lot of coverage. But anyway, we stood in that first federal election and got a small vote. It wasn't a big deal, but it was enough to tip off a bit of a discussion in the mainstream press about where immigration was going and what it was going to mean for the future. And a young Tony Abbott, who was a young journalist and crack gun for The Australian at the time, wrote a wonderful piece in The Australian. There was some Jewish chap who had the top of the page, the opinion page, for immigration and multiculturalism, and Tony Abbott had the lower half of a page in The Australian, arguing the case that we'd been making. So that looked good. Then in 91, Neil Brown resigned from the seat of Menzies here in suburban Melbourne. It was a safe Liberal seat. And we decided to test our luck. So we registered. I was the candidate again. and we'd had a little bit of coverage on radio, a little bit of coverage on TV in the interim time, but nothing big. But so I stood for Menzies, that by-election, and got nearly 7%, 6.9 or something like that. And then the phone started ringing pretty hot because in a double dissolution scenario, in a full Senate election, that would be very near a Senate quota, which was, I think, 7.5% at the time. But, in a by-election, being a nobody party that nobody really knew about, the system weren't that keen to give us that much coverage. We were minimised enormously, the same as it was in the federal election the year before. But, the ABC rang and this one rang and that one rang, and we started to get a bit of a reputation for just honestly talking about the problems with immigration and multicultural policy as we saw it. And we knew from just observing the newspapers and the radio and the TV that the crowd out there were very interested in our point of view because they'd been polled for years before we got onto the scene. And the polls that were held on immigration and multiculturalism invariably said that people were a little bit cautious about the future of both these policies and the way they were going to turn out in the longer run. So we thought, well, we need a little bit of merch, would be the term today. We produced a little badge, which I'll show you here. If I can get the reflection off it, hold it a bit closer to the camera. It says Australia is full, and it's a map of Australia, as you can see, with mostly desert and the little green fringes. So we were handing them out to members, and they were very popular. And we used to do a bit of graffiti at night time in very public places, but not private property. And the graffiti was very similar to what you see here. It was just a cardboard cutout of Australia with the word full in it, and you'd spray or paint around the edges of the cardboard cutout, which was, it was this big, and it was easily folded up to put in the back of the car, and paint's pretty easy to carry around. And we went to all sorts of places that had high visibility, billboards or underneath freeway flyovers, and obvious in various parts of Melbourne. One night we even took a ladder into town and climbed up and put a painted full in the middle of the Australians symbol, the red Australia. There was a plastic one hanging off off their building in Flinders Street in the city. So our symbol became reasonably widely well known. We were never caught doing it, but people knew it was clearly folk out there who agreed with the message. They didn't know who those folk were or how small our crew actually was that was doing it. But lo and behold, the next year, Romper Stomper came out, and the young Mr. Crow starred in that. That was his sort of step up. The chap who used to do all the reviews on SBS, he famously refused to review this film. Now, in the film, the makers had decided to try and smear AAFI by having in the skinheads, Russell Crowe's skinhead headquarters in an old factory, they had a cardboard stencil, exactly the same as what we use, in the
Well,
background, up
can I
against
ask,
a wall.
Dennis, do you have the matching skinhead tattoos to go along with it?
Oh yeah, you can look all over me. I'm just covered with them. The day I
Just
get a
like every
tattoo with,
anti-immigration advocate, we're all secret Nazis, right?
yeah, exactly. Or you can see my Nazi, flag. I mean,
Uh,
it's just terrible. But it wasn't just in one scene. It was about in three scenes. And poor old David Stratton was beside himself. He was on telly with Margaret Pomerantz, and she sort of said, "Well, what's wrong with you, David? It's just a film. I'm not doing a review to talk to people about such a shocking film, blah, blah, blah." It became, quite the conversation when, as time passed. And the maker of the film had the gall, when it was doing quite well at the box office, because it was so outrageous. The maker of the film was on radio talking about the film and said, "Oh, we did a lot of research for this film and blah, blah, blah." And I can tell you they didn't. They made stuff up and they tried to get us a very bad name, but didn't worry us. The chap in Queensland, actually, who produced these for us, he happened to have been in Melbourne with his family on holidays, driving around town, and he saw a couple of these Australia with full in it. And he knew exactly what it meant. And sometime later, we received in the mail a big box of these, and they're like, you can see them. They break off dog tags, and he had all these blanks for some job that he wasn't going to be using and just recycling. So he went back to Queensland, set up his machine, and produced these, sent them down to us, and said, "With my compliments, I can guess from your graffiti what you're on about." That graffiti ended up, there was one particular electrical substation on the bank of the Yarra, just on the city edge, and we put our logo on there, and it ended up in I think it was the Herald Sun, and it just had this nice shot of our Australia with full in it, and the heading underneath the photo was, "There must be an election coming." And there was. So we pedalled away with the elections, and we gained enough publicity through, well, 60 Minutes actually came to the Menzies by-election in April, I think it was, 91. They came down with a sound man and a cameraman and a reporter, and I was the candidate. So they came out to a school where I was handing out on the day of the election, and they approached me and they said, "Oh, can we have a chat to you?" And I said, "Sure." So I got somebody to relieve me handing out to the folks going in to vote, our how to vote cards. And they said, "Look, this is not really serious. I've been sent down here. You're obviously a bunch of racists, and I'm just getting some file footage to sort of please the boss." So I said, "Well, here is our manifesto. Here is this. Here is that." I gave him a whole stack of stuff. I said, "You take that back to your producer in Sydney and you tell him to look through it. We're not here for fun. Not many people have got the, let's say, the initiative to do something like this, to stand out in public on election day and say, 'Hey, vote for me on these grounds.' Read those grounds, and you'll find that we're not the devil incarnate. We're not Nazis. We're just ordinary Australians from the suburbs, no particular background, no particular issues to grind apart from this one, which affects everything else we do in this country as to who we are and how we go into the future." So they said, "Okay, we'll get a bit of footage and we'll just wander around and talk to a few voters." Well, About 3 weeks later, Jeff McMullen presented a 60-minute segment on Australians against further immigration, aided by Graham Campbell, who had noticed our work and rang me up before the Menzies by-election and said, how would you like some help? What can I do in the run-up to the by-election? And I said, well, if you're game, I've got an old Holden Ute. You can jump into the back of that. We've got a megaphone, and we'll do it the old-fashioned way. We'll drive around the electorate of Menzies and just not too quietly use the megaphone to talk to people as they did years ago when I was a kid. You'd know there was an election on because there'd be, cars and utes and trucks going around the street with bunting on them, and you could hear the loudspeakers. So it was something sort of out of a previous age, but nonetheless it struck a chord, and it was odd enough. So the 60 Minutes crowd changed their mind. A chap by the name of Peter Westacott, who's since died, but he was the main man behind looking at our material and changing their mind as to how they were going to present this to the public. So when they'd looked through all the material, they'd spoken to us some more. They got hold of Graham Campbell. He was on it. And so were Rod and Rod Spencer. So they spread their bets because they also talked to people like Nino Randazzo and a whole lot of other people in the ethnic industry, really about how terrible it was that it had come to this, where people were asked to vote on immigration and multiculturalism. But anyway, Peter Harvey, who used to do the segment on 60 Minutes at the end of each program, the next week after the segment that Jeff McMullen fronted and went off very well, we thought, the mailbag next week, Peter Harvey just had on screen a selection of the wonderful letters that people had written to Channel 9 saying, thank God somebody's at least trying to do something about this at last. So it had gone pretty well, and we got a bit more coverage on 7:30 report on the ABC, and then the phone started to ring each time there was something in the paper. I was an office holder. I was the national secretary because we ended up having branches around the country, and also candidate, and also bottle washer at the functions and speaking at the functions and coordinating with the electoral office. I wasn't on my own, but I did a lot of it because I decided to dedicate so much time to it. And so I was the man, essentially, and I was very well supported by Rod and Robin Spencer and other members, and we were a roving sort of posse, if you like, at by-elections. We specialised in by-elections. Then came the Bonython by-election. There was the Wills by-election, then the Bonython by-election, I think. And I stood in South Australia for the Bonython by-election. And that was where we first beat the Democrats in the seat of Bonython. And that's when...
now, that would be the Australian Democrats, correct? Which were a sort of a centrist party which popped up for a couple of years.
That's right. And they had a heavy emphasis on the environment and immigration. Now, I actually joined the ACF as a life member, so I could manipulate and politic inside to get their once sound immigration and population policy back to a sound immigration and population policy. Lots of meetings, and I'm just not going to bore you with all this organisational bureaucratic stuff that takes. But when I did it the first year, at the annual general meeting. And they can't stop people going to the annual general meeting and asking questions and putting them on the spot at question time about whatever, any question you would like to talk about. But after I'd given them a bit of a serve about getting their immigration and multicultural policy back out of the Labor Party's hands, because the then leader, Philip Toyne, was essentially a Labor Party apparatchik, not officially but in spirit, and he had come out of the Aboriginal affairs industry, and he was very concerned about, we were in the ACF getting motions passed to present things at annual general meetings and so forth. But at the first annual general meeting I went to, I was approached by a chap by the name of Henry Telcher. Now, Henry Telcher, a lovely bloke, he was a professor of chemistry at RMIT, but he was also Jewish, and he was a Dunera boy. Now, a lot of your viewers might not have heard of the Dunera, but it was a ship that had a lot of Jewish refugees that Australia allowed to come here because they weren't wanted elsewhere. Anyway, a lot of those people on that ship have been lionised and had a couple of books written about how well they'd done in society here since they'd arrived, and that's all very well. But when they've done these books, especially one that was only done fairly recently, they particularly excluded mentioning Henry Telcher as a Dunera boy because it had sunk in with them that he was part of Australians Against Further Immigration. And when I used to chat to Henry, I didn't know that much, or let's say I didn't know as much about the Jewish lobby and their machinations inside the political system and both sides of politics. I didn't know very much about it, and Henry didn't want to know about it. But he said to me, just do the best you can. These people will come after you and get in your way in ways you can't even imagine. He said, just be aware that, that could happen. Now, Henry was one of the people, when we revised the manifesto, because we had to revise it a few times as we got more information, Henry's name was on the manifesto as one of its co-authors, as was mine, as were the Spencers, as was Wing Commander David Francis, who died a couple of years ago, all sorts of people. So we were kind of accepted as sort of part of the machinery. Graham Campbell was enormously helpful in getting us off the ground. He lent us an air of credibility just by coming to that first Menzies by-election. And each time, he wasn't breaking Labor Party rules, by the way, although they were scathingly disgusted by him doing that. He did it because he thought there's no other show in town that's giving people a say. And he was in the Labor Party, but he was not breaking the rules to come and campaign for us in Menzies because it was a blue ribbon seat. And we weren't going to win it. The Labor Party didn't even stand a candidate. So since the Labor Party didn't have a candidate, he was therefore, by Labor Party rules, quite allowed to go and campaign for whomsoever he wanted. So that sort of happened, and then Graham was on hand so many times during these by-elections and things, just trying to help shape the arguments and get us some airplay. we wouldn't have gotten nearly as far as we did unless Graham had taken us under his wing. And he had me on his staff as a volunteer from 94. And he found half a job in his stretched establishment because he had the biggest electorate in the world, not just Australia, but in the world. Most of Western Australia, apart from the south west corner, was Kalgoorlie. And he had more Aborigines in his electorate and understood them better than anybody else in the country. And as you've seen, he's still with us and still fighting. And long may that be so. We talk often.
Yeah, he's an absolute legend. He was actually the one that introduced me to your work, so big shout out to Graham for that.
Yes. Well, if it wasn't for Graham, we wouldn't have been able to make the dents in the big machines that we did. And there was money offered to pull his endorsement as the candidate in Kalgoorlie. And Graham fought against this very well, and he maintained his candidacy against the Labor parties and Nick Bolkus and a whole lot of other people. Nick Bolkus was the immigration minister at the time. There were a whole lot of inducements offered by various groups to the Labor Party to get rid of Campbell in this sort of official way. But Campbell was well enough attached and had a good enough handle on his electorate that he wasn't moved by that. They got him eventually. He actually gave the last interview to Andrew Olley before he fell off the peg. But so over the years we kept going, and in 96 we had a very big meeting that I organised in the Heidelberg Town Hall down here, and we filled the place up, got into the papers a bit. The local rag covered it, the Heidelberger, and folk knew that there was a game on because the 7:30 report put that program. The meeting was held on Australia Day, 1996, and I'd been talking to people I'd come to know inside the ABC, quite a senior person in Sydney. And I said, look, I've got a list of incidents and reportages by ABC that have misrepresented Australians against further immigration, and it just keeps going on. There's a meeting at the Heidelberg Town Hall on Australia Day, 26th of January, 1996, and I'd be happy not to pursue the case that I think is pretty good to charge the ABC with bias when it comes to coverage on AAFI. But I'd be happy to forego that if you would like to cover that meeting. Well, they said, yeah, we will. Contact this person, and they'll set it up in Melbourne. So they did. And it went to air on that night of Australia Day, the 26th of January. They came out to the town hall. The meeting was in the afternoon. They said, look, we're out here to get footage for the program tonight. We've got all the backstory. We've just got to get some footage here at the meeting. So all that happened, and it went to air, and it was tricked up with some really foreboding, low-tone music or background rumbling.
We've all seen it before. It's the classic trick they do.
And it slowed down, right? Campbell's there adjusting his glasses, and they've slowed his movements down.
And they've darkened the scene as well. They've got the lights switched off or whatever.
Well, No, the footage they had was fair enough. It was real footage. It's just the
Fair
way
enough.
they manipulated the stuff. They had a nice shot of me at the microphone saying, you know, the Australians are back. We're back from the beach, meaning we're here to, let's say, examine and hopefully explain where we're going on the big issues that are going to shape everything of the future. So my phone rang off the hook after the segment with people saying, how on earth did you convince the ABC to give you that coverage given what they've been doing to you for years now? So you've already heard the story of how I kind of twisted their arm gently. But as a result of that, that was the election. Well, when it was on the 7:30 report, the new host of the 7:30 report, because they just nationalised it. Previous to this time, we'd had 7:30 reports differently in different states. They all did their own thing for the 7:30 report. But ABC management decided to make it a national program, and they decided the short straw. Paul Lynham wanted it badly because he was at the ABC at the time. He was their senior man. He did a lot of stuff for them on the 7:30 report, and he wanted to have the 7:30 report chair. But he missed out. Who got it? Red Kes, Kerry O'Brien. And the night of Australia Day, when this item was all packaged up, nothing to do with him, he was the new presenter for the national program. And he said to the audience after they'd run the segment on AAFI's meeting with Campbell at the Heidelberg Town Hall, he said to camera, oh, and the election hasn't even been called yet. Well, the election was called the next day by Keating, and it's the one he lost because Campbell took him apart at every opportunity and made him look stupid. And that's why Campbell's time inside the ALP was numbered. So he became an independent, and that was when did he become independent? November 95, just a couple of months before the coming election. And he was re-elected as an independent, and he became the parliamentary member for Kalgoorlie, and he was an independent, and he represented Australians against... he didn't represent that party. He represented Australia First when it was formed, going through 96. So...
Can I ask what the reason was why he didn't join AAFI and instead founded his own party?
Well, because he wanted to broaden it out. He wanted to broaden out the national...
That's understandable.
The national agenda, and he felt...
Well, he has a big focus on foreign policy as well, so that makes sense why he would want that.
And industry policy and trade policy.
Yeah, of course.
And a whole lot of other stuff. He was a very well-rounded politician. And he'd had great experience across all sort of primary industry just about. And he was a knockabout bloke who understood people. You know, he didn't come out of the university or the union movement or a law school. And he was a migrant himself as a kid from England. But you couldn't get a more Aussie bloke. He understood an enormous amount. And for that, we should all be forever grateful. But it doesn't happen because time rolls on, and the system found it so much more convenient to have Pauline Hanson as the new captain of Ship Australia as far as patriotic politics is concerned. And Campbell was simply shaded out It was as if he wasn't there because there was so much both anxiety, titillation, novelty around Hansen and the various powers that be behind the scenes and behind the curtains. They thought, well, this is really good. We've finally gotten rid of Campbell. And even a couple of journalists with brains in the Australian, like Beatrice Faust and Shelley Gare, they both wrote columns with all the hoo-ha and carry-on about Pauline Hanson. They said, she's only saying what Graham Campbell has been saying for a few years now in AAFI. Why is all this fuss about Pauline Hanson? Now, her maiden speech was written by Pasquarelli, who Graham, and with a little help from me, got him pointed up to Queensland and into Pauline Hanson's trust. Campbell chaperoned Hanson for months until the maiden speech. Now, I couldn't go over and help Campbell in the election campaign, him in Kalgoorlie, because I was a candidate for the Senate in Victoria again. So Pasquarelli went over to Campbell's office, and it was on a deal for 3 months or whatever it was. And then because Hanson had won this pox on both your houses vote in Oxley, which really nobody thought she was going to win, but for the ham-fisted antics of both the local Labor Party people trying to crucify Hanson for having a letter printed in the local paper about the unfairness of Aboriginal welfare, perfectly reasonable letter. And then the local Libs panicked and said to themselves, oh, gee, the boss, being John Howard, he's not going to be happy about this. I mean, this woman's being painted as a devil and a racist and blah, blah, blah. We only accepted her because it's a general election. If it was a by-election for Oxley, we wouldn't have worried. It's the safest seat in Queensland, if not the country, for the Labor Party. But because both Labor and the local Liberals rubbed her out, the local people who weren't particularly latched on to Hanson, but when they saw her treated in this way by both the major parties, they decided to do a protest vote and vote for her. That's how she got in. She didn't expect to get in, neither did anybody else. And it took from the election, which was, I think, in the March of 96, we got Pasquarelli up into her office and he wrote her maiden speech out of all the stuff that Campbell had been circulating from AAFI and his own very good work. He loaded Pasquarelli up with all that to go from Kalgoorlie up to Hanson's office. So that's where that maiden speech came from. There was nothing new in it and hardly anything from Hanson. I mean, she was running around at the foundation launch of One Nation early in 97. The two Davids were sort of there, and David Ettridge was saying, oh, yes, it's great to have this wonderful book, Pauline Hanson and the Truth. Well, that's a whole different story, getting that book out and getting it around. But the thing was, Hanson hadn't even read it. But when things started to shake out and it was clear that Campbell was not going to be allowed to maintain his very credible leadership of this budding party, Australia First. It was spreading all over New South Wales and Queensland and Western Australia. Of course, down here in the red state, it wasn't doing nearly as well as it was in the rest of the country. So it was a registered party, and meetings were being held, and candidates were being picked. But when you were on a hiding to nothing, and somebody told Graham, I think he might have mentioned it to you, that in that period of time, Hansen was the recipient of the good, the bad, and the ugly press to the tune of over $2 billion free publicity. And of course, it's very difficult to do anything. So all we could do was just try and guide at the sides and provide information. A couple of people from AAFI, and we'd agreed, myself and the Spencers had agreed that we'd let AAFI go into abeyance and see what happened with the One Nation thing. But eventually they decided, for reasons that still aren't really clear to me, but they decided to throw their lot in with Pauline Hanson after having the same opinion of her acumen and capacities as everybody else pretty much had, for somebody who had no background of anything to do with immigration and multiculturalism. And unfortunately, we'd been able to successfully convince Hanson that the AAFI material and Campbell's material and Australia First, the material was so sound that she just, decided to clone it, as you would if you've been presented with a pretty good platform that's been worked on by intelligent people for some years. So I never really had any problem with the platform that she'd adopted. I thought, there's not much I can do about it. But things became sort of a bit rabid, and it's all in the books and the newspapers of how people found it hard to take Hanson herself particularly seriously, although they might have been very worried about the issues. And, she'll be a hero to a lot of people until she leaves, because, she's got, nobody can doubt she's got a certain rat cunning and cut through. But I consider it a lost decade, at least, when, if you look at the numbers, AAFI's by-election results and so forth were irritating both major parties. They were very glad to be rid of us. So as soon as Hanson refused to take Graham's and my advice to stand for the Senate in the 98 election instead of, what was it? She stood in Blair, I think. She couldn't win Blair, and we knew the numbers would be right against her. So we said, look, stand for the Senate in Queensland. You'll romp it in. People love you, No, she wanted to stand in Blair, and she lost. And not only did she lose, but from talking to Graham, she stood a candidate in Kalgoorlie, which bled his vote, and he wasn't able to use his preferences. It was just
it's
so
nothing
sad.
Short of traitorous, right? That decision.
Oh, it was just dumb. I spoke to David Oldfield about it, and he just sort of threw his hands up in the air and said, there's not much I can do about it. I spoke to the Spencers, and they said, we've really got it in the bag now. We've got the limelight and blah, 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 and Graham's yesterday's man. And it was very disappointing. They were wonderful people at one stage, and we're all very close. But when things like this happen, you find out the real nature of some of the people you're dealing with.
Well, Dennis, that's we were going to talk about a couple of other topics, but we're not going to have enough time, so I'll get you on next year perhaps, and we'll cover the rest of the immigration in general. But just as a note on your One Nation criticism here, we've seen what the consequences of trusting One Nation to be the vanguard of Australian patriotic sentiment, or perhaps at their hardest elements back when they were beginning. You could even say they had a nationalist streak to them. Pauline's criticisms of Asian immigration in particular come to mind, although...
But she's gone back on that.
Well, that's the thing. Since then, we've only seen all of that energy, all of that press go to absolutely nothing, as Pauline has stopped discussing immigration, really walked back a lot of her criticisms of multiculturalism, even to the stage where recently, just this last week, she was filmed wearing a turban at I think it was a Sikh temple or something like that. She's trying to win the Sikh vote or some sort of an Indian denomination vote. And she's she's been running candidates, I should say, because it's not even a recent development, which are Indian. Now, I'm sure you have full knowledge of this, Dennis, and as does every other Australian listening. But Indian immigration to Australia is probably the Asian immigration of Pauline's day, meaning it is completely transforming our cities. I think to the negative, without disrespecting people. I do think that it is changing Australia in a negative way. It is taking us away from what made Australia great to begin with, and it is swamping the population of Australians that are already here.
Did I show you this?
Sure, you can show me. Yeah, so that's your knitted jumper.
That's right.
And that perfectly fits what we're talking about, right?
Hanson has been a huge disappointment. I didn't want to spend too much time.
No, well, we won't dwell on it.
She is a waste of time. And if you look at the numbers from 98 when she struck out, Howard took the numbers up to Rudd at 260,000, I think it was, when he handed over to Rudd. Rudd, in his first budget, chucked on an extra 80,000, right? And a couple of years later, that was 2008, a couple of years later, you had the Big Australia discussion that's been going backwards and forwards ever since. We are on, at the moment, a hiding to nothing. People are going to look back at these years and realise, well, for the major part of the time that Hanson's been in there, immigration's gone up through the roof. For the time that AAFI were operative, with Campbell as the spearhead, we had immigration right down. We had Howard and Ruddock rolling over, saying before the 96 election when he got in, he was saying he would keep the numbers the same. As soon as he got in, he made a cut of 19,000. And Ruddock got up and said, if we need to cut it again next year, we will. And he cut it the second year by a further 7,000. And then Hanson started saying, oh, that's all because of my influence, yada, 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 when they were on the record saying that they were going to cut it. But as soon as she was gone and Campbell was already gone, they both struck out at the 98 election. She didn't have to, but she was, just determined not to stand for the Senate where she could have won. Campbell did his best in Kalgoorlie and was cut off at the socket by One Nation. We are heading towards a white minority status. Now, there are a lot of people in this country who are just completely paralysed about this as they see what you've just described happening all over the place, city and country now. There's nothing wrong with having a sprinkling of others. We've had a sprinkling of others, all sorts of others, be they Indians or be they Chinese. We've had a sprinkling of them since Federation, right? But when the numbers stack up to where you're getting the mainstream media doing stories about the Chinese vote and the Indian vote, we know we're in trouble. But what has Dutton said? Today in the paper, in the Australian, he's walked back from his cutting immigration back to 160,000. That's gone. We've got footage of him in India cuddling up to the education industry over there, just waxing so lyrical about how wonderful it is, the multicultural influence that the Indians are bringing to Australia. Dutton can't be trusted either. So I'm not sure where we go from here, but one thing we can all do is on our ballot papers, every time we vote at local, state or federal level, just write 2 words on the top of your ballot paper in the clear blank space. You're not fouling your vote. You're numbering whoever you want to vote, or whatever party, whatever individual, however you like. It's a valid vote. But in the clear blank space on top of the ballot paper, just write reduce immigration. The folk are going to turn this around by scaring the big guys in Canberra as to what will happen if enough people hear about this campaign. It doesn't cost anybody anything. You don't have to join any parties. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is remember to write that one focused message. Now, the AEC is charged with the responsibility of reporting to government after every election as to the write-ons. Were there any consistent, focused write-ons? This happened in 1982 with the No Dams campaign in Tasmania. It was a write-on. It was run through a couple of by-elections. And then in the 83 election, Bob Hawke dearly wanted to win. And he saw the Hastings by-election when Peter Reith first got in Hastings in Victoria. There was a 40% write-on vote for no dams. The green triangle with no dams in it. That's what they wrote on the ballots. It happened in Sydney, it happened in Canberra, and it happened in Tasmania, and it happened in Hastings in Victoria. Now, the election was just around the corner. Hawke saw this write-on as significant. So to shore his vote up, he said that he'd stop the Franklin below Gordon Dam, or the Gordon below Franklin Dam, whatever it was. He was going to stop the dam. And he did. He stuck to that promise. But I'm trying to tell you that there is something there, a mechanism in the system that we invented and gave to the rest of the world. It used to be known as the Australian ballot. We were the first to organise the secret ballot and have the government run the election. That's how far ahead of the game we were. I mean, we also invented National Socialism here. We had colonial socialism, and then in Federation came in 1901, and we had National Socialism. By jingoes, hasn't that been given a bad name lately? But back then, it was the workers' paradise. It was balanced. It was strung around a small number of policies that the major segment of the population agreed with. Hence, it was federation. Hence, we had the Immigration Restriction Act, which lazy people called the White Australia policy. Nonetheless, we still had sprinklings of others coming in, but they were never in numerical numbers to be the massive threat that they collectively present to us today. Now, I don't hate anybody. Hate's too big a word. I hate standing in dog poo, right? That I hate. But I don't hate any people. I know Asian people, right? Individuals you can get along with fine, but not to the point where you're going to be bringing in, for the callous purposes of wiping Australia's founding people out as the majority founding people of this nation. There was no Australia until we built it and we framed it, and we wanted it to stay predominantly white forever. And I think that's what we all should be thinking about. And there are a hell of a lot of migrants to this country who agree. If you go to the Reduce Immigration website, on the very first page, you'll see comments and, we've got to be careful of migrants. We don't, because most migrants agree with us. 70% of people are concerned about the future of immigration and multiculturalism. Think about the population makeup. Nearly 50% of Australia's population today is born overseas or has overseas-born parents. So it stands to reason that a lot of migrants, their parents, their grandparents, and their children and their grandchildren have looked around, saw what a great country we've built here, and say, why would you pull it apart in this fashion? So the only tool that I can come up with that costs nobody anything, and there's no meetings, there's no names, there's no pact drill, is a simple thing. Just remember to write reduce immigration on top of your ballot papers. When they get that message in the numbers that's required, if they do not change these policies, That's when we grab the pitchforks. That's when we go to Canberra in our millions. But they're not going to take it seriously until there is some sort of message that everybody can understand, that everybody can write, regardless of whether they're black, brown or brindle. If they're concerned about the future of the country, that's all you need to do to give them the greatest shock they've ever had. Just remember that when the next federal election comes around. But don't let your councils or your state governments off. For those elections, yes, do it too, because it's here out in the suburbs, not Canberra, but out in the suburbs of the major metropolitan areas and all over the rest of the country that we have to put up with these wacky ongoing policies from both the major parties.
Well, Dennis, on those impassioned words, which I have nothing to add to because you've absolutely said everything that I needed to say right there. We're far away from an electoral option, and hopefully we can build towards that. We can recreate something like Australians Against Further Immigration once again in this country and hopefully lead it towards electoral success. But in the meantime, we need to be looking at ways in which we can organise people that agree with us and convince those who don't to come to our side and to get politically involved.
They just need to know about that ruse, this wonderful ruse of just writing 2 words on your ballot paper, how powerful it can be.
Certainly, but there's a lot more to do.
Oh, yes,
there's a
lot
lot more to do, of course. As you've
and it doesn't stop anybody else doing other stuff. Anybody can keep doing whatever they like on these issues, wherever they like, as long as they remember to do this too.
Yeah, 100%. It's very easy. I wouldn't be against it at all. I might do it on my next ballot. How about that? But thank you for joining us this week, Dennis. I appreciate you coming on. There's so much more we need to talk about.
We'll do it again
there will
sometime.
definitely be a part 2. And it's been absolutely great. We basically just covered you covered the history of Australians Against Further Immigration for the whole episode, and really there's enough there to fill the whole episode. So thank you for coming on.
More than one.
Maybe we'll get you on next time to talk about more current issues, because obviously the fight that you were fighting back when you were politically involved actively, it rages on today, and that we still need people to fight back against this. It is a country-changing level of immigration, and so thank you very much, Dennis. And if there's anywhere where you'd like to send people to look at more of your work, would you like to let them know now?
Yes, just go to www.reduceimmigration.wordpress.com. There's a whole range of icons. There is decades of information stacked behind those icons. The FAQs, the how-tos, the press we've been able to get. There's a select bibliography that's often updated, so you can see it's a reverse chronological bibliography with all sorts of stuff from the mainstream press, going back decades. There's a lot of stuff in there. And as far as I'm concerned, if Pauline Hanson off the street, given our information, could understand it, nobody else has got any excuse whatsoever.
Well, there you go. I'll make sure I put that link down in the description below so everyone can go check it out. And like Dennis said, you've got no excuse not to. So I expect to see lots of people repeating that information, reading it, and spreading it far and wide.
Incidentally, Pauline said that at a meeting in 2013, when a friend of mine suggested the write-on at the meeting, she said, "Oh, no, I wouldn't recommend that because that'll invalidate your vote." It was said again, clearly, calmly, "No, I think that'll invalidate your vote." That's bad enough, but wait for this. I was talking to Jeffrey Blaney about this in 2013, and he said, "Oh, no, Dennis, I think that'll probably invalidate your vote." And I said, "Jeffrey, I can settle this for you right now. Here's my hand. I'll bet my house against yours that it's not invalidating the vote, that it's perfectly reasonable. And there is audio on the site of myself on radio talking about it. There is no doubt. But the issue is, if people like Blaney didn't know till I explained it to him, and Hanson, you just can't explain stuff to. There's a lot of people out there who are probably under the same impression that you're not allowed to write anything on, even though they talk about it in the papers when it happens and people do stuff. Sorry to rave on, but you can understand a tool like this needs to be known about. I don't know how we get it out to the broader public because the journalists, all the journalists I know, are too chicken to talk about it in the paper or the radio. But anyway,
well,
we'll
who's
fight
even
another
worth
day.
voting for anyway? Who's even on the ballot that's worth voting for these days anyway? What does it matter if you invalidate your vote?
Well, we've got to have a government. That's the situation we're in. But we've got to have a government doing things the way we want it on the fundamental issues that affect every other issue that we have going around. So
yeah, exactly.
We'll talk again.
We will. Thank you for joining me, Dennis. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks very much.